welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Sirish Pulusani and Professor Paul Denary. How are you doing today, Paul?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, quite a few more developments in the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Yep.
I think some of the most significant news this week is actually the idea of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, right?
Yes.
So that is obviously huge news, not something that Russia wants. But also we have Turkey on this other end of the spectrum also saying they don't want that to happen. So can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, this is a good place to start. So we've been talking for a while about this idea that Finland and Sweden were going to ask to join NATO, and they've now done that. And there's various aspects of that are interesting, but one of them is that NATO works by unanimity, which is a nice way of saying that any single NATO country can veto the admission of a new member. And basically, Turkey has said so far that it is not going to approve this, that it's going to veto Sweden and Finland becoming members. And the issue that Turkey has is, in its view, that Sweden in particular is too easy on Turkish separatists, Kurdish separatists who have taken up residence in Sweden. So there's been a long-running Kurdish separatist movement in Turkey linked to Kurdish separatism in Iraq and Syria. It's a long story, including a movement a group called the PKK, which is pretty widely regarded as a terrorist group as well as an independence movement. And I don't know the details, but apparently some of those ex-PKK fighters have taken up residence in Sweden. And I think the Turkish government feels that the Swedish government has given those people way too much latitude to act in Sweden. So it seems that what Turkey is doing is trying to put some pressure on Sweden to get Sweden to put some pressure on these Kurdish separatists, maybe to push them out of the country or to limit what they can do. What is interesting and I think difficult to predict is how far Turkey will push this. Are they looking for some symbolic statement so that President Erdogan can claim that he's made a victory? Or are they really going to hold this up? And of course, if they hold this up, that would be another big sort of damaging blow, I would say, to Turkey's relations with the EU and with the rest of NATO. And this has become a very complicated relationship in recent years.
So you're saying it's due to internal conflict in Turkey. Is there any pressure from Russia on Turkey? And what does the relationship of Turkey and Russia look like?
Yeah, the Turkey-Russia relationship has been very complicated in recent years. The leader of Turkey, this guy named Erdogan, is a sort of populist authoritarian leader. And in that sense, I think has some commonalities and some admiration for Putin. They have some common interests in the region. They're also in other, and one of the big things that Turkey did that really upset the rest of NATO was it bought S-300 anti-aircraft systems from Russia. So a big weapons deal a few years ago. And Turkey basically argued these are better, cheaper systems than we can buy elsewhere. So Turkey in recent years has been, let's call it, a more assertively independent member of the alliance. On the other hand, Turkey and Russia have been on the opposite side of things in Syria, where Russia has been deeply involved in Syria borders Turkey. So Turkey is deeply interested in what's going on there. And a few years ago, a Russian warplane was actually shot down by Turkish forces in Syria. And at that time, there was worry about a lot of escalation, but they seem to have walked back from that. Turkey is also a major supply of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, to Ukraine. And these so-called Bayraktar drones have been one of Ukraine's most effective weapon in this war against Russia. So Turkey's been in different places and different sides of this conflict, always with some sense of its own interests.
I mean, there is some YouTube video of Turkey's leader and Putin getting some ice cream together. I think this was taken some years ago, but they are both considered pretty authoritarian leaders, right? So I can imagine there is a pretty close relationship there. So if Turkey does not want Sweden to join, what about Turkey? What about Finland? though.
Well, I have to say I know less about that. That I think it's got the same complaint about Finland, only to a lesser extent. Mm-hmm. And so I think maybe one of the questions down the road might be whether, if is it possible that Turkey would block a Swedish bid for membership but not a Finnish one? Mm-hmm. Really hard to say. What I think is going to happen. Well, I shouldn't. I would be surprised if when push comes to shove, Turkey actually vetoes this. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, what Erdogan has said so far has not easily offered himself an easy walk back. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
What does this mean for Russia? That if Sweden and Finland become NATO members, what are the implications for Russia?
It's a big issue for Russia, in part because Finland has a pretty substantial army because it requires basically every adult male to join the army, and it has an 800-mile long border with Russia, way up north. So it potentially, right, if NATO were to put troops and weaponry along that border, it would substantially change the border that Russia has to defend against NATO. Now, I don't really see NATO doing that, but that's the Russian perception, is it's now got a much longer border with NATO rather than having up in Scandinavia, having two neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, between Russia and the next NATO member, which is Norway. The other thing that's important in this respect is Sweden does not have a big military. But of course, it has a very big military potential because it has one of the most advanced arms industries in the world. It makes a very advanced fight. It's one of the few countries in the world that really make advanced fighter jets. The Saab company, which we used to know for groovy automobiles, which are no longer made, but also makes aircraft. And they also have very good artillery systems and all kinds of things. So to bring that into NATO, or bring that capability into NATO, is significant as well.
So NATO is essentially a defensive alliance. What do each of what does Finland and Sweden contribute to NATO, and what does NATO contribute to those two countries when this happens?
So I think what Sweden contributes is an advanced military establishment, even though the army itself is tiny. I think what Finland contributes is not only sort of creating maybe a more effective defense perimeter, especially as it relates to the Baltic states, but an incredible knowledge of Russia. Finland has been next door to Russia for a long time. Finland fought a war with Russia in the 1940s. So that's one of the things it brings. And also, again, as I said, a substantial frontline military. The other thing that's important is, as far as Sweden goes, is if you look at the kind of the approaches to Petersburg and the Baltic Sea, they run right through some islands that are controlled by Sweden. And so one of the things that Sweden has been worried about in recent years is not a land invasion from Russia, but Russian submarines in Swedish waters. And so from a naval perspective, and what are called sea lines of communication, having Sweden integrated with the alliance will make that more coherent as well.
One of the narratives put forward at the beginning of this war is that Putin and Russia started this due to NATO expansion, right? And now this is what's happening is more NATO expansion. It seems like with Finland and Sweden. So this cannot be good for Russia or Putin. So have they kind of backed themselves up into a corner at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I've been one of those who's always believed that we're doing this because of NATO expansion has always been kind of a bogus argument. But they know that it's effective in the West because they're famous. We've already talked about, some famous Western political scientists who buy this argument and advance it themselves. And they would love to see, I think we should take it seriously, the idea that they really don't like the idea of NATO advancing closer to their borders, because regardless of the fact that we regard NATO as a defensive alliance, they see it as threatening. But yes, to the extent that they'd rather see NATO further away rather than closer, and to the extent they'd rather see it smaller rather than bigger, they have shot themselves in the foot.
So as far as going forward, another major development is the United States announced an additional $40 billion aid package. It seems like Ukraine is getting a lot of support. It seems they are pushing the Russians back. So what does this mean as far as how this plays out now?
Well, I think what we see that's interesting going on now, especially with this aid package and with actually there was a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers, I think, this week. What you see now in the United States and in the rest of the West is a recognition that this war is going to drag on for a long time, and a public commitment to supporting Ukraine for the long haul. And I think that's incredibly important because, as you know, all along I've been saying this is going to go on for a long time, and at some point it's going to be a question of who hangs on the longest. I don't see any signs that Russia is tiring of fighting this war. And so it becomes very important then that the West continue to support Ukraine.
You said you don't see any signs, but it seems, I mean, can morale even be good right now over there? It seems a few of the generals over there were fired. What is it like? I know it's hard to get good information.
It is hard to get good information. I imagine that there is fury within the Russian military and at the Russian military. And of course, some of that, is reflected in some of these generals getting fired. Although I have to say, generals getting fired when things go bad in war is pretty standard practice. That's just how it goes. So I think I imagine that inside the Russian army, there's an immense amount of backbiting about whose fault this is, right? Probably, I'm guessing, people in the army criticizing the military for not, criticizing the civilian authorities for not having told them exactly what was planned and letting them get ready. I think there's probably complaints at the lower level about what the senior officers are doing without knowing what's really going on the ground. Complaints on the civilian side that the military misled them about what their capabilities were. I think there's all of that backbiting, I have to assume. And there are some of these signs, as you're saying, that are leaking out. But I don't think any of that, I don't see in any of that a sign that Russia is thinking, maybe we should pack it in. And in fact, this is where I think I am an outlier among Western analysts. I just read something today. It was a British colonel or retired colonel being interviewed about the state of war in Ukraine. And he basically was saying that the Russians have lost every battle so far. Right. And he's pointing out they got defeated outside of Kiev. They got defeated outside of Kharkiv. And now they're kind of fighting to a stalemate in Donbass. And I look at the map of southern Ukraine, and I think that in all the stuff that is strategically important, the Russians have gained territory. That is to say, they have taken control of much of the Black Sea coast. And that is what is really strategically important in terms of, do you want to hold that territory 10 and 20 years from now? And so I think what we are seeing is a change in Russian tactics, which is to say, we're going to keep on fighting in Donbass in eastern Ukraine because that pins down Russian troops. And in the meantime, we are going to consolidate authority over the northern Black Sea coast to make sure that whatever happens down the road in eastern Ukraine, we are never getting that territory back. And that's why we hear them talking about annexing Kherson, which is to the northwest of Crimea, and we don't hear them talking about annexing Donbass. So they want to get Donbass back into Ukraine because it's kind of a place for them to influence Ukraine. So I actually think we've been looking at the wrong part of the map.
So you're saying Russia has actually achieved some of the strategic objectives that it set out to achieve?
Yes, I would put it slightly differently, which is if you were to go back a year and say, what might Russia want to achieve in a war on Ukraine? We would not have talked about capturing Kiev. We would not have talked about capturing Kharkiv. We would have talked about the Black Sea coast. We would have talked about the possibility that they might go all the way across from the border between Russia and Ukraine in the east, along the Sea of Azov, across from there to connect with Crimea, and then further across from there to take Odessa and to connect with this little slice of Moldova they've taken that's called Transnistria. Now, they haven't gotten as far as Odessa yet. But if you were to freeze this conflict today and say no territory changes hands after today, they would be maybe a couple hundred miles from the border with Moldova. Mm-hmm. And my guess is they would say, okay, we're going to reinforce and strengthen our control of that territory stretching along the northern Black Sea coast. And then we're going to bide our time again. Mm-hmm. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to take the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be in a good position to launch that attack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to stress, I'm absolutely speculating. But what I am saying is the territory that Russia has gained on the northern Black Sea coast is really significant. And they gained it, most of it, fairly early in the war, except for Mariupol, which they've been, fighting against these holdouts. And in a way, I don't think their plan was to get their asses kicked outside of Kiev or Kharkiv. But I think it would have made it would have made a lot of sense to say we're going to fight so-called holding actions, right? We're going to attack Kiev, we're going to attack Kharkiv, and force the Ukrainians to defend that so we can get this other stuff. Mm-hmm. And if you had framed their strategy that way, you'd say it succeeded. Mm-hmm. Now, I think in the end they had actually I don't think that was a ruse. I think they really thought they were going to take Kiev and Kharkiv. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is they've lost in a way that so far leaves them in control of some really valuable territory.
And why is that so valuable? What is the strategic advantage there?
Well, it's there are two kinds of strategic advantage. One is to cut off Ukraine from the sea. Right? It makes Ukraine a much less viable economic actor if it can't export its wheat, export its metallurgical products, and so on through the Black Sea. Now, let me digress briefly to say, in that respect, it would be another instance in which Russia shoots itself in the foot, because that would just force Ukraine to push all of its exports through Western Europe, and it would tie Ukraine that much more tightly into Europe. Mm-hmm. But I think the big picture is, and this is where Turkey and Russia come back together, which is historically, it was really the Russian Empire and the Turkish Empire sort of fighting for who was going to control the Black Sea. And I think what Russia sees is an opportunity to increase sort of its ability to try to make the Black Sea essentially a Russian body of water, not an international body of water. Mm-hmm. There are those who will argue, and I'm not one of them. There are those who argue that if you go back 500 years or 1,000 years, not quite 1,000, but hundreds of years, that Russian foreign policy, in essence, has been about trying to control the straits of the Bosphorus, right? Trying to eventually get to Istanbul and seize in control of the straits. I think that's a dramatic oversimplification and exaggeration. But it is the case that Russia thinks that more Russian control over the Black Sea is better than less Russian control. Mm-hmm.
What does it look like for Ukraine? Like over the next month, best case scenario for Ukraine. What does that look like?
I think the best case scenario for Ukraine is that through some combination of Ukraine being able to turn to the offensive and Russian troops simply not wanting to fight anymore, that Ukraine can eject the Russians from eastern Ukraine and turn their attention to those areas in the south. Mm-hmm. That's the best case scenario.
And there's some talk of a couple of Russian soldiers being killed in Russia by Ukrainian forces even. Right. And I'm just quickly scanning the headlines. There's even some certain things saying about what does it take for Ukraine to win even. Yep. So, I mean, are we even talking about a possibility of us going back to, pre-conflict, essentially, pre-February 23rd?
In terms of control of territory?
Yeah, in terms of control of territory.
I think in terms of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast and so on, I think by and large that would be very easy to do, except when we talk about the southern part of Donetsk Oblast, which is that corridor along the Black Sea. I do not see the Russians giving that back. Mm-hmm. I see them fighting hard to retain that. Mm-hmm. I think one of the interesting strategic debates for Ukraine now is, they've pushed Russian troops back to the border of Russia pretty close to the Russian city of Belgorod. And I could imagine a situation in which the Ukrainians think, rather than fighting against this heavily armed Russian or very powerful Russian army in Donbass, let's push into the soft part, right? Let's push into Russia towards this important Russian city of Belgorod and say, we can't beat you here. We're going to threaten you there, and then maybe try to trade some territory.
Mm-hmm. So you're actually talking about Ukraine now invading Russia.
That's what I'm talking about. And I don't think it's going to happen, because I think there's still a sense that might get us into more trouble than we want, because the Russians could still do a lot more damage than they have. But I would want to look, and I don't know, right? Would it be easier to try to take that territory than try to take back this territory in the south that the Russians have now really started to reinforce? I don't know the answer. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians have, they've blown up some refineries and some pipelines, and they've attacked some things in that area around Belgorod already. Interestingly enough, however, they have not claimed responsibility for those attacks. Mm-hmm. And because I think they realize that the sort of propaganda and messaging of Russia changes a lot if the Ukrainians invade Russia. Mm-hmm. There's also a part in which it would be a huge kind of coup for Ukraine to say, you're not the only ones who can do the invading around here. I
mean, it would have been unimaginable, I think, a few months ago, right, of that
Absolutely.
Happening? Yeah. Paul, you know Ukrainians on the ground there. What is your sense of the morale at this point, and what their expectations are?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one. The gas shortages now, if you own a car, it's hard to put fuel in it. Most people, people have lost their jobs. I mean, so much is just broken down. Slowly but surely, Ukraine is simply becoming increasingly dependent on aid that's coming in from the West, because it's very difficult to run a normal economy in a country that's at war. And so, I think there's a certain resignation among Ukrainians that this is going to go on for a long time. And my sense from the people I talk to is that, I think people are experiencing a lot of emotional trauma. There was this sort of initial trauma of being attacked, but also at the same time, this incredible rallying of spirit to fight off the Russians, and this enthusiasm about having defeated the Russians, around Kiev and so on. And I think now people are beginning to come to grips with the fact that this is going to go on for a long time, and back to normal is something that may not happen for many of them, for months, if not years. And so I think the resiliency and the commitment to fighting is there, but people are, I think, very, sort of emotionally drained from what's been happening.
I can only imagine. We talk a lot about, Russia's strategic objectives and what's happened so far, kind of on a tactical level, but at a global level, economically, it must be devastating, obviously for Ukraine, but for Russia as well, right? I mean, all these corporations have pulled out. What does it look like in Russia right now? Like I can't imagine people are in any way, despite the information they're getting from state media, this cannot be good over there.
Well, so from what we can tell, Russia has actually adjusted pretty well to the sanctions and to the financial sanctions. They have a very, very competent head of their central bank who tried to quit when the invasion started, and basically was told, "Sorry, you can't quit."
Why did he try and quit?
I think because she did not want to try to manage through this, and I think she was probably in her own way thought that this conflict was going to be a disaster for the Russian economy, and she was like, "Okay, guys, I'm out." And they said, "Not so fast." And like I think most patriotic people would, she's doing her job the best she can, and so they've done things, for example, to defend the currency, so that some of the the collapse in the value of the ruble has not happened. The ruble's actually held its value quite well. On the other hand, what beginning to be reported is price rise, obviously goods are short in supply. So in some cases, things just aren't available anymore. And in other cases, the prices are going up. So the sort of short-term disaster for the Russian economy hasn't happened. But in the long term, like two things are going to be happening in the long term. One is sanctions are going to begin to bite in terms of imports, as supplies of imports, stocks in warehouses, especially of essential parts, are going to drop. Not only the things that Russians consume, but the things that keep their factories running. A lot of that capital equipment was imported. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're going to see is just a decline in not just in GDP, but in what people in Russia can buy and eat and so on. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be gradual. The flip side of that is there's people all over the world who will be quite happy to sell stuff to Russia.
I was about to ask you about that. Which countries are doing business with Russia and are actively engaged in trade and providing aid?
Well, obviously China. But also, countries all over the world who are exporters want to export to Russia. And there are countries like India that are happy to buy discounted Russian oil. So again, the idea that the Russian economy was just going to collapse was not going to happen. This is going to be a much more slow burn kind of thing. Mm-hmm. In terms of consumer goods, China supplies most of our consumer goods anyhow, so they can continue supplying those to Russia. But in terms of like high-end machine tools, those were mostly coming from Western Europe and from the West. And those are going to be very difficult to replace. Mm-hmm. But the fact that Russia had already been under some sanctions from the West since 2014 had given them some time to decrease their reliance on certain kinds of Western products. Mm-hmm.
What does, before this war started, there was video of like Chairman Xi and Putin, essentially acting like they were partners. What do you think he wants, Chairman Xi in China? Like what does he want to see happen? Is he exerting any influence on Russia and Putin at this point?
I don't have any reason to believe he's exerting influence over Russia, other than I still believe he told them you better not start a war before the Olympics or during the Olympics. I don't think it's that kind of relationship where Xi calls up Putin and gives orders. But I think it's becoming a kind of relationship where people in Russia call up people in China and say, "Hey, how'd you like to buy some oil that we can't sell anywhere else?" Mm-hmm. And hey, would you sell us, X, Y, and Z? And by the way, can we pay you in rubles? And what's happening gradually is becoming more politically and economically dependent on Russia. Russia's becoming more economically dependent on China. Mm-hmm. And China, again, by and large, has been very patient. And so my guess is China will not overplay its hand, but slowly and gradually will ask for a little more of this and a little more of that. And the trading terms will get better. It will get more and more in China's favor. Mm-hmm.
So it's potentially a good thing for China.
Absolutely.
Everything that's happening right now.
Well, and for years, the United States is saying it wants to, quote unquote, pivot to Asia and really deal with the challenge from China, because everybody in the United States realizes that in the long term, the big sort of competitor is not Russia, it's China. And once again, that's not been possible. In fact, Biden is finally going to Asia this week. And there's all this sort of saying, finally, Biden gets to focus on what he wants to focus on. So I think China also has benefited from the fact that the United States, to the extent it's focusing on supplying Ukraine, can't be supplying Taiwan or anybody else out in that part of the world. Now, again, I think the big downside for China is, I think everybody now understands that the world is more threatening. And these authoritarian powers like Russia and China suddenly appear much more threatening to the U.S. and Europe. And the idea that trade is going to get them to be nice to us is no longer believed. And so we are going to see this deglobalization that China probably wished would not happen for another 20 years or so. Mm.
So let's just shift the discussion here a little bit and talk about this, because I think it's very, very important. You brought up the fact that the United States weren't able to focus on China to the level that they wanted to because of this other thing that's happening with Russia and Ukraine. what are the United States' objectives in relation to China?
I think the U.S. interest as it relates to China are to, I'm going to use an old-fashioned word very deliberately, are to contain China, which is I don't think the United States has any particular interest in hurting China in any way. But China sees its interest in expanding its influence in places of interest to us. Mm-hmm. Taiwan, the South China Sea, right? And of course, China now really extending its influence in Africa. So I think the United States would like to see China's influence stay about where it is or where it has been rather than getting bigger. And China doesn't like that idea.
Has this war changed China's geopolitical objectives in regards to Taiwan?
That's a very good question. And I suspect that there are a lot of conversations going on in the Chinese general staff and also probably, in the Politburo about what are the lessons of Ukraine. And again, I think the analogy, can't be drawn too tightly because they're very different situations. But I suspect that those conversations, both about the military lessons, but also about the diplomatic and political lessons.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? So from this point, I mean, it's crazy to think that it's been 3 months now, since February when we first started our discussions of the invasion happened.
Yep.
We're going on the 3-month mark. What do you foresee? First of all, how long is this going to play out? I mean, is this something we're talking about years or is it just months? And then what do you see happening?
So here's my best guess. Or maybe I'll give you a couple of different scenarios, if I can do that. I don't think Russia is going to gain a lot more territory in Ukraine. The question is, does it lose territory? To what extent can Ukraine push the Russian troops back? To the extent that line stalemates, then I think the question is, can there be then a negotiated ceasefire? And I think that's going to be really difficult because, as I said, Russia, I actually think that a compromise over a boundary in eastern Ukraine, I think that's reachable. I think it will be very, very hard for Ukraine to agree to surrendering the territory that Russia has occupied in southern Ukraine. And I think it's very unlikely that Russia will want to give that back. Mm-hmm. If that's all true, then what that points us to is either a de facto ceasefire or a negotiated ceasefire that then leaves us in a sort of what you might call a Korea scenario, where you have 7 decades of heavily militarized confrontation. And of course, in the Korean case, you have a demilitarized zone to keep the armies apart, which I think it would be very difficult to get even to that point between Ukraine and Russia. Mm-hmm. So the really interesting question for Ukraine is going to be, what unjust things will you be willing to agree to in order to actually sign a peace treaty? So, for example, I think almost everybody acknowledges that it's very unlikely that Ukraine is ever going to get Crimea back. At what point would Ukraine, recognizing that, sign a peace treaty that says so? Right? Say, yep, we're ceding that territory to Russia. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a hard pill to swallow. But I think not nearly as hard a pill to swallow as giving away more territory even after that. Mm-hmm. And again, in southern or eastern Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So to follow this train of thought, there's another train of thought that says, in fact, stalemate is not the way to peace. That the only way to peace is for somebody to get defeated. And that at this point looks like either, basically that the Russian army collapses and Ukraine can really take back that territory itself, or maybe something else.
I mean, it just seems like with all this support and aid from the West to Ukraine and then Russia's immense capabilities still, that, total defeat is that even on the table?
I don't. Well, again, let's just play out some hypotheticals, right? Russia seems to be struggling now to find more soldiers to bring to the front, right? So let's say, for example, Ukraine can push Russia back in eastern Ukraine to a front that Ukraine is satisfied with, right? And then it can dig in and defend that front and shift forces down to the south. Now, I have to say, this is all assuming that the Ukrainians actually agree with me about which is the more valuable territory. And they may not. They may not. That's my prognosis. Ukrainians, it's not for me to tell the Ukrainians which territory they should value. And that corridor that Russia holds along the North Sea, along the north coast of the Black Sea, it's not very wide. So in theory, if you were to really concentrate on one spot, you could cut that corridor off from Russia. Then it could only be resupplied through Crimea, which itself would be tricky. And so now the other huge advantage Russia has with that corridor along the northern Black Sea is they can bring the Black Sea Fleet to bear. And so then you get into the question of can Ukraine begin to take out some more of those ships? And that's another kind of escalation because some of those weapons would probably need to come from the West, anti-ship missiles. And there have been people saying since all the way back in February, I know people have been saying what we really need to be giving Ukraine is anti-ship missiles.
What is another important thing that happened is the surrender of the Azov steel factory in Mariupol. Can you just talk about that briefly?
Yeah, those guys are going to go down in history. They're going to be writing songs and books and making movie about those guys. And I say guys, it's men and women for decades. I think you and I already talked about Enemy at the Gates, right?
Yeah. Fascinating movie. About Stalingrad.
Their heroism was incredible. But in the end, they had to make a decision. The defenders of the steelworks and the Ukrainian government. And the decision they had to make was, do we want to make this a suicide mission? And ultimately they decided they did not. Many of those fighters were badly injured. The number that could continue to fight was dwindling, and the ammunition they had to fight with was dwindling. And so I think they decided basically that, okay, we fought the good fight. I think the interesting question now is, it's interesting the terminology they use. I've noticed that not too many of people have used the word that's actually what happened there, which was a surrender. They've surrendered to the Russian forces, and they've been brought to Russian-controlled territory. The interesting question now is, what does Russia do with them? They could essentially treat them as prisoners of war, or they could decide to turn them into propaganda tools and coerce, torture, whatever them, deny them medical care until they can get some of those guys to go out basically and say, yes, we're Nazis. Yes, we're funded by the CIA, and so on and so forth. So,
what has Russia?
Knowing what I know about Russia, I can't imagine they are going to lose the opportunity to portray those people as Nazis.
To use this as propaganda, essentially.
Absolutely.
What does
Which
Russia
violates the Geneva Conventions, but we haven't seen too many signs yet that Russia is really keen on following laws or norms.
What has Russia been doing with prisoners of war?
I don't know the answer to that. They haven't taken a ton of them, but I think in many cases they've put them in these so-called filtration camps, and they've been hanging on to them. There have been some prisoner exchanges.
Okay.
Because actually, I think Ukraine's taken plenty of Russian prisoners, and so there have been some prisoner exchanges, which is kind of it's the civilized thing to do. And I always laugh when we talk about doing the civilized thing when you're busy blowing each other up. But
there are some civilized aspects of war, even when it's total war, right?
It's a strange thing. My grandfather fought on the Austrian front in the Italian army. And told these stories about how they would call these ceasefires so they could clear the bodies away and like bury their dead, and then go back at it and kill more people and do it all. I mean, it was strange.
Very much so. So any other key takeaways, Paul, as we are nearing this 3-month mark and there's still no end in sight? Like anything else that you think is important?
I think, I guess I would stress, if I were to summarize two things, which is Much of the politics will still be driven by what happens on the battlefield. But the stuff off the battlefield, Sweden, Finland, the European Union, all those questions of what happens in the West in response to this, I think is hugely important as well, because I think it's going to last for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And
does Finland and Sweden joining increase the chance of escalation? You said Finland shares a border with Russia, this long border with Russia. So is there more of a chance now that NATO is going to...
I think one of the really shrewd things about the timing of this is Russia doesn't have the force right now to invade Finland, right? What will happen in the medium to long term is, this is what Russia has threatened, is it will deploy more weapons in that area, including nuclear weapons. I think from a Swedish or a Finnish perspective, that doesn't much matter because Russia has nuclear weapons that can reach anywhere on the earth. So actually moving them closer to somewhere is symbolically important. I guess the one other thing I'll say, and I'm going to end with it this week, and maybe it's where we should pick up next week, which is I think there are more and more discussions now about planning for how we provide for Ukraine's security after this conflict. And so, as we think about what Sweden and Finland feel like they need for their security, what does Western support for Ukraine look like after this conflict ends?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that connect with how we get this conflict to end?
All right. Well, that's a great question. Something great to talk about when we meet again next weekend. Once again, Paul, thanks so much for joining me, and we'll continue this discussion next weekend.
Sounds great. See you next week.
All right. See you next week. Take care.